stand in front of a cabin here in the Cypress Hills, and I was thinking about this. I was thinking about that maybe in 20 years or 30 years from now, my grandkids is going to ask their parents, why did Hans and Janet build a house out here in the wilderness where there's no pavement, nobody has ever lived here before. And they're at least 8 miles away from any other civilization. Why would they build here? And I thought to myself, I asked myself the question, why did we? And it came from my youth. When I was 12 years old, my parents divorced, and I moved in with my mom in an apartment building. Basically, it was cement blocks, cement Lego blocks stacked on top of each other. Each one was an apartment. And we lived on the 3rd floor to the right. And it was like a bird cage. It had been a farmer's field, but now it's covered with cement and covered with asphalt. We had lived next to a forest where I went and played every day as a kid, and now I was locked up in a cement block. And I longed in my heart for God's wilderness, for His trees, for His birds. So in 1977, when I came to Canada and went on this piece of land, I fell in love with it right away because it was uncontained, it was unspoiled. There was no asphalt, there was no pavement, there was no telephone lines, there was no power lines. There was just trees growing here, and there was nothing has been touched and defiled by man. And it was just God's raw nature that's been like that for thousands of years. When buffalo roamed and the First Nations roamed around and camped on these hills, I fell in love with it and made a deal with Janet's dad, and we purchased this land. And I wanted to build a house that came out of the land that was undefiled. And so the entire house is built of logs, just like the one I'm standing beside here, poplar logs. Even the windows are built of poplar logs. And the rocks are rocks that we found around here, and the sand comes from the hills. And the inside walls are covered with raw poplar boards, again expressing God's creation. Not knowing it at the time, but the wilderness drew my heart to God. It says in Romans 1 that there's no excuse to man, because God has revealed Himself in nature. And even in Denmark, when I stood in front of the sea and saw the endless amount of water, I stood in awe. And stood in awe of that endless amount of raw power. When I see the mountains and I see all the peaks for miles and miles, unspoiled by man, I stand in awe of God's creation and ponder what kind of a mind would create something like that. When I listen to the birds and see the leaves, I just standing again in awe of God's beautiful creation. You see, when I was 12 years old, not only was the landscape grey and sterilized, but my heart was grey and sterilized from observing my parents' divorce. And now I stand here, and I stand experiencing peace, and I experience the color and the life of God's nature, of God's creation. Now, Jesus got on a colt when He rode into Jerusalem a few days before He was crucified. A colt is an untamed donkey. I've been on an untamed horse. An untamed horse kicks and bucks. I don't know if this donkey bucked or kicked when Jesus rode it. Like my wife said, probably the peace of Jesus that was in Jesus calmed the colt. In the same way, I believe that being in God's nature calms our hearts. Some of the last words Jesus said to His disciples was, "In this world you will have much trouble, but do not lose heart, for I have overcome the world." Do not give as the world gives. I give you my peace I leave with you. So I find standing here in the Cypress Hills, underneath the trees, listening to the birds, it gives me peace that comes from God. God didn't want us to worship the creation. He wants us to worship the Creator. And He sent His Son Jesus so that we can come to encounter the artist who molded and created this beautiful wilderness. Let me make you thanks. In the midst of this creation, He created us uniquely different, but special. He created us in His image, that we too can enjoy His beautiful creation and enjoy the colorful flowers and beautiful bird and wildlife. God is a God who is, in some ways, He's wild, and He created wilderness for us to come to experience who He is. It's for us to look beyond the creation and see this amazing God who is so artistic that He could create so many different animals and so many different landscapes that was untamed and just a reflection on who He really is. So our hearts will be drawn onto Him. And then we are drawn onto Him, standing in His nature, in His creation. We experience His amazing peace. And I want you to have that peace. So Lord, I pray for everyone who feels troubled by this world and troubled by circumstances, that they will experience peace, your peace, God. And they will stand in awe of your creation and ponder what kind of mind, what kind of God created that and created us in the midst of it. Remember, when He created us, He was pleased and He said it was well done. God didn't create a mistake. You're not a mistake. You are somebody that He loves.